Hi, I'm Alex Colopy, and I'm here today talking with Dr. Hyan Park about her research and engagement with young children in the art studio. Hyan is a talented artist, art educator, and researcher with a commitment and the skill to be with and listen to children in the classroom and studio spaces. She holds a PhD in art education from Penn State University, and parts of her dissertation titled Out of the Lines, Hauntings, Politics, and Aesthetics in Children's Art have been published in peer-reviewed journals and book chapters. She is the co-editor of the forthcoming anthology, Visual Arts with Young Children, Practice, Pedagogy, and Learning with Dr. Christopher Schulte. Thanks for your time today, Hyan.
Thank you for having me, Alex.
So I'm excited to speak with you and for my students and for other students who are pre-service teachers to hear more about your work. In one of the courses that I teach, I've assigned your article from the Journal of Art Education titled Creative Collaborations, Emergent Play in the Preschool Art Studio that explores your work with 5-year-olds in a museum-based preschool. What I'm struck by there is in the article, you not only explicitly discuss children's play as very sophisticated, but you demonstrate that belief. You provide a very detailed account of 2 play events with careful attention to children's engagement with materials and peers, including specific movement, emotions, and dialogue that might otherwise be made sense of as rather mundane, just children's messy or extracurricular play. So first, I'm wondering if you can speak to your role in that studio as an observer and researcher and writer of children's play. Can you sort of explain in plain language what you mean in the article by taking a phenomenological approach?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So like you mentioned, that research was conducted in a preschool space, art studio space in a museum-based an early enrichment center. And I was an interim art studio facilitator and teacher during the summer of 2015. And I, of course, went in as a researcher with this like specific research question in mind. It was my first time doing like an actual research as a master's student. I was excited and didn't know what was going to happen at all. But, you know, like I was trying to follow those like traditional like research structures, like having a methodology, having a research question, ready to like collect data and like documentation. So my first like hat would have definitely been a researcher, but as soon as I walked in and started to engage with children, I learned that, you know, children, because I wasn't like their like classroom teacher, they weren't seeing me as a teacher per se. I was their like friend, adult friend, and also someone who does art with them. And definitely because of my phenomenological approach, I was an observer. Not only that, I was facilitating certain art activities. So what I mean by a phenomenological approach is basically coming from a lot of childhood studies approaches that see children and childhood as a phenomenon rather than like an object to study, and something that you don't necessarily try to make generalizations, but engage with that phenomenon by observing and then just exploring relationships and attending to emergent moments. And I was compelled to use this approach because during that time, my then mentor, Dr. Christine Thompson, used this phenomenological approach heavily in her research. I'm going to be talking about a lot of Tina Thompson's work, I think, throughout this video, but basically how she incorporated a phenomenological approach in her research with young children is just being curious about children's art, not really trying to intervene or control what they're drawing or what they're doing in their work. So, which is also like beneficial for the research of children in nature, because it's kind of opposed to doing like formal interviews with children, if that makes sense. It's more like an informal and emergent approach when looking in children's social lives and their works. So yeah, because I was there in the studio taking these like different roles, I thought that the phenomenological approach made the most sense to me in that research particularly.
So the phenomenological approach, it sounds like, was responsive to the way that you think about children.
Of course, yes. I don't like still don't want to, do research with children, taking those like, I don't know, control groups or like, like formal interviews personally, but rather be an observer and a facilitator and just be there with them.
So you had mentioned in the article a bit about your role as a teacher, and just now you mentioned how the children were relating to you. And I'm curious if you can talk a bit more about what you called your role as a facilitator. My understanding from knowing you is also that your engagement with children is informed by Reggio Emilia. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to how you engaged with children.
Sure. Yeah, what I mean by the facilitator and also the participant, I think really heavily draws on the idea that we are scaffolding children's art, not necessarily, like giving like instructions specifically, although those types of art activities are important and has to be done in certain times. The way I approach this play-oriented and child-initiated art experiences was more on a perspective that children can facilitate their own artworks and art experiences rather than adults controlling it. So that's why I intentionally use the word facilitator rather than I don't know, like I don't think I use teacher a lot in that specific article, if not at all. So I was looking at my role as somebody who would help children if they needed like technical help. So for example, in that article, those play events, they started off by asking me to use like duct tape for them, or like use specific tools or grab materials for them. So I would be there for, assisting them and be there to help in any ways, not necessarily to intervene. And I would sometimes play with them. I would sometimes draw with them. I would be invited to draw with them. So in that ways, I think I was more of a participant in their art making. And going back to your question on Reggio Emilia approach, this is also something that really informed my philosophy in art education, especially with young children. Just to give a brief introduction of Reggio Emilia, it's a philosophy that started in northern Italy. It is actually, the region is called Reggio Emilia, and it was founded by the community members and the pioneer named Lois Malaguzzi after World War II, because they really thought a really provocative and child-oriented approach to early childhood education was needed in that community. So it emphasizes all these like child development of all their languages. A term they use a lot is the 100 languages, right? So it really highlights how children have like expressive languages, communicative, symbolic, like ethical or relational and cognitive languages, and that are inherently in children. So, and the question would be like, how do we as adults uh, like scaffold that learning experience with the environment we are in? So environment and this classroom space and nature, they're all considered as the third teacher. And especially when it comes to art, it becomes important because you are surrounded by this space, materials, and your friends and everything that's just interacting in that moment. So they actually call the art studio space in the like preschool as atelier, which could be translated into just an art studio in English. And the person who is responsible for the studio space, so like an art teacher or somebody who had like an art education, would be called atelierista. And that, again, that's an art teacher in that space. So I was, looking back, I guess my role in that studio space was also trying to be that atelierista, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it was a Reggio environment, because like you would know, having like a Reggio philosophy doesn't really mean that like you just walk in and say that you are doing Reggio. It means that you would need like all these like natural materials and all the things that you would need as a whole, as a school, not just like one person trying to emulate that Reggio like space or material. So but again, I think I learn and a lot from how Reggio Emilia does art with children. So yeah, does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. So
Okay.
even if it's not a Reggio school or
Mm-hmm.
space, you're walking in with this philosophy, which
Right.
supports you to see the many ways that children are thinking and learning and communicating with each other and making sense of their worlds, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Um, you emphasize, and I'm sure this is also connected to your philosophy, but the process of art making as not only material, but importantly social
Mm-hmm.
over those predetermined art activities or products. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious what you might have to say about this. Is there a point where play is not art making? Or what makes the play event art?
Yeah, that's a great question. My short answer to that would be no. I think there's not a distinct like line between like play and art, especially when it comes to young children's play and art. Even thinking about like adult artists, like contemporary artists, I think those are all forms of art. I mean, play. It's exploring something new. It's exploring something other than the real world, and discovering new experiences. And in many ways, I think there's a lot of similarities and a lot we can do within that like intersection of play and art. So yeah, I think when it comes to children, everything can be play. And going back to your the first part of your question on drawing as a social practice, and like how children like do art activities as a social performance. I again draw from my mentor Christine Thompson, who um, argues that drawing is a public performance, because it is like part of their self-discovery, learning about the culture and about the world in general. So and it's been more of a shift in the field of art education to see children's art as a social practice, whereas in the past, just like general child development theory, a lot of art educators looked into child art based on those developmental paradigms. We try to just look into children's drawings as artifacts, not necessarily looking into their culture, contextualizing the child. So recently, not that we are completely disregarding all the developmental theories, because those have very good intentions, and they are helpful in understanding children's art. You won't necessarily expect a 2-year-old child to do all these realistic drawings. You do anticipate them to start with scribbling and move on from there. But also what Thompson and other recent scholars are saying is that we do also need to look into their social agency. And there's a lot of literature I can talk about, obviously, but it's intensely a social activity. And I think it's a privilege as researchers and adults who get to be invited to their social world when they're drawing. So yeah, I think, and because it's a social activity, like drawing itself, that's why there's a lot of relationship with the play, because you can draw while you're playing, you can play while you're drawing, and then there's a research done in drawing in play, drawing with play, and all these other conceptualization surrounding children's art and play. So it's really interesting. I think there's not a one right answer when you look into children's art and play. It's always just, it has to be contextualized. It has to be I think we need to just be willing to be curious about what they're doing in their art. So.
And something that I'm hearing that is coming up as you're talking is that while there are these, of course, there's these skills that children can be taught, and they can taught how to use a material. The way that you're talking is not as if there are children and they need to be taught art, but there's something already there that the
right
can already do it.
Absolutely.
It is not disconnected from the fact that children can play.
Yeah, I don't think children were ever taught to play. You know what I mean? I believe it's inherently in our DNA, I guess, to want to play. And I think if we consider art as play, I think to be willing to explore and to do art, whatever form that is inherently in children's agency as well.
So although I was totally enamored with the play events, I was just sucked in, it made me miss working with young children. You discussed how that wasn't the original plan. You discussed how not only that your plans didn't work out how you might have imagined, but that this might have been more valuable than you thought, that there's something different that emerges from children's participation that can't be done or can't come up from teacher-directed lessons alone. And so I wonder how that informed your planning moving forward. How do you plan for this kind of environment?
Yeah, that's another great question. So yeah, I obviously didn't plan on having these types of emergent play events. Again, as someone who wanted to do research with those children, I had all these research questions, and I had lesson plans for every day. But as a lot of child educators and teachers would say, it doesn't really go. It does your plan doesn't really get to be the way it is. Like it has to be flexible. Something happens and then sometimes the children actually lead you to do something other than the lesson plan. So the way it helped me move forward is that I first had to let go of my preconceived ideas and like all these biases I had with like having to do with children's art, uh, my research and my role and all the activities that I thought was like going as planned. So that letting go was really liberating for me. And when those types of play events happened, I think that's how I was able to attend to those moments without like being like anxious about all the mess or all the things that were gonna happen. I just, started documenting it. I think I just even offered more materials to them. I let them do it for about an hour. So, and that really produced that kind of experience, I would say. And because I was the one who was allowing that to happen, I also, got to be responsible of like all the cleanups and all the things that happened afterwards. So I think children do have the ability to facilitate their own activity as they wish. And the whole concept of the article was, I think it's part of the title, it's emergent. So it is important, not that I'm like disregarding the importance of having lesson plans, but what might be emergent in those moments could also be equally meaningful, is what I learned. And I still have that philosophy. It's not easy because you have this desire to control, like as an adult and someone who just want to facilitate a meaningful art activity. But it's a constant reminder that if things don't go as planned, it's still gonna be like meaningful. It's still gonna be an art experience for the children, although it may not seem so in the adult's eyes.
Yeah, the even the language that you use now, the shifting between art experience and art project, or art experience and art lesson, are quite different. And I know some of the other things that you had planned might have been more traditional activities, but as someone who is outside of the art education world, I was curious about the value of those similar activities in other disciplines and other content areas. And you had said before in the article, before those art events happened, you had given them time to work on sketchbooks. And so there's a little jump, but I'm interested in learning a bit about how you use sketchbooks with young children in the art studio.
Yeah, I love to talk about sketchbooks because, again, my mentor, Christine Thompson's work draws heavily on children's sketchbook drawings. And the reason why a lot of early childhood art educators are interested in sketchbook drawings is because it's completely voluntary. Sometimes it could be initiated by adults, like you might want to set some time apart from classroom, like traditional activity time, to let them work on sketchbooks. So to be able to work could be adult initiated, but the drawing contents or the conversations that emerge during that sketchbook drawing time, they're all completely facilitated by children themselves. So, and that's really like interesting because that's when all their personal like lives and all their like cultural narratives come in. And a great example of that is popular culture, children's popular culture. You may not see a lot of like popular culture contents coming out when you're doing traditional like crafty art activities, not to denigrate that again, but when you give them the ability to do whatever they want, draw whatever they want, a lot of popular culture references would come in. And again, Thompson talks about this, I talk about this, because when we are there as adults interested in children's sketchbook drawings, we get to be invited to their cultural world, and we see how those types of like narratives develop and how they are seeing those images. And also another perspective that really highlights the importance of sketchbooks is it's like its similarity to journal writing. And Thompson also talks about Anne Hass Dyson's work, who is a great scholar in children's language arts education and just literacy studies. I'm sure you know Dyson's work, Alex, too. But yeah, so I think, and the way Dyson talks about children's journal writing is how they practice writing, and sometimes graphic language gets to be involved in those journal writings, and that fluency of both verbal and graphic language gets to be developed through those writing events, and they get to be writers, they get to be performers, and they just explore those multiple languages and multiple social worlds. So I think there's a lot of potential in sketchbook drawings, and which is why, like in Saturday Art School during my grad school, we always set the first 15 minutes of the art classes for just sketchbooks. And that's a great way to, invite students into that new space, not to just jump right into, introduction of the day. Just because some students can be late to do, those classes, it's a good way to segue to the lesson of the day. And I think I've seen some classrooms incorporating a lot of sketchbook activities as well, and preschool classrooms, I mean. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential, and I believe personally that all teachers should incorporate that into their lessons. Yeah.
Yeah, I had been thinking about, as I read your piece, the ways that it could be used in other classrooms, not necessarily the art studio, but I also, what I saw in your piece and when I'm talking to you is your attentiveness to how an activity and an environment and peers affect a child. And when you talked about the traditional, maybe developmental approach to looking at children's drawing in stages, I also thought about the fact that there's this difference between looking at children's artwork and trying to interpret it, and trying to, whether it's assign a grade to it or make sense of it, the maybe more historical approaches to psychoanalysis, for example, that might interpret the emotional meaning of a child's artwork. But all of what you're talking about is what's happening in the now, not just that children are representing their culture or representing their interests and ideas, but that this is happening in a particular space. And so what I really appreciate what you're talking about is this in the now, in that particular context, and the potential of that is different than just a child drawing on their own or giving a drawing of themselves or of their interest to their teacher.
Yeah, absolutely. And I still write about this importance of attending to the present, because we tend to associate childhood with future or the past. I don't think it really requires a lot of practice to be willing to attend to that now moment. And yeah, I think it's really important to highlight that, and I appreciate you mentioning that as well.
And I will say I want to step back because I am already convinced, right? And I know not just preaching to a choir of like-minded individuals who are really interested in at least working to be with children in this way.
Mm-hmm.
But you brought up that a couple times that there are still um, anxieties about control,
Oh,
and there
yeah.
are still demands that folks have on them as teachers. And so
Mm-hmm.
someone with different training, knowledge, or experiences than you, and different anxieties and desires in the classroom might argue to the effect something like, well, this is a preschool and one in a museum. And as you pointed out, and you can see in the beautiful images in the article, it is super messy. So this couldn't happen in kindergarten or elementary school. And
Mm-hmm.
yet, in another chapter that you had written, the title of that one is Drawing Together Toward a Relational Ethics of Ignorance. You wrote about your experience using what seemed to me as a really similar disposition to art education with kindergarten children. Can you
Mm-hmm.
tell us about that work?
Yeah, I think that's a really good transition, because I know I acknowledge that, you know, being in that special space is not a common thing to all teachers in the world. And we are most likely to be in a traditional classroom, right? And the piece that you just mentioned, Drawing Together, is research I did. It's a separate research I did for my doctoral dissertation a couple years ago, and that was in a kindergarten classroom. But I would say, again, like you mentioned, the similarity is that I go there as someone who is an interested adult to like be willing to attend to those now moments and not necessarily perform in a similar way as their classroom teachers would do. So, to just talk about that piece a little bit, I write about how my role as a researcher, an adult, they kind of perceive me as an undergrad student, like a college student. So it was like a different setting, a different role. But again, um, what was interesting for me was that I naturally developed this role as an artist in residence, because, you know, as someone who was trained to be an artist for my whole life, I went to art schools and like I have a degree in fine arts. I When children asked me to draw like these popular culture figures, it started off by like asking me to draw like princesses for them, but like when they recognize that I can do it quite well, like in technical terms, like, you know, they kind of saw me as someone who had this like extraordinary ability to draw for them. And, you know, they greeted me rather than saying hi, but like holding a pen and a paper and like, you know, asking me to draw something for them. And most of the times I felt confident to draw whatever they asked me to draw. But the time when it came to drawing popular culture figures and those that I weren't necessarily aware of were like challenging, and I started to ask for help. I need your help to describe, like, I need your description of that character in order for me to draw it as you wish, you know? And full disclosure, I had never watched any Star Wars movies, but like the most frequently mentioned like character, especially from the boys, was like Darth Vader or like Luke Skywalker and all these Star Wars characters. I had never like, you know, like drawn before. So I would ask them to like, just, can you describe how like Darth Vader looks like? And like, they would be like, really you're an adult and you don't know what Darth Vader is. And they were like, it's black and like it has like, you know, this weird mask and everything. So I thought that was really interesting to collaborate with children and let them be that expert. And that's how it inspired me to write that piece, to like talk about my, again, going back to that desire to know, desire to be fully like aware of what I'm drawing and where we're going, but also that necessary performance of like willing to be like not know and like willing to be that person who is in the vulnerable position. And I draw from this French philosopher called Jacques Rancière, who talks about the ignorant schoolmaster, because it made perfect sense to me, because in that piece he talks about, you know, how students can learn even a new language by teaching themselves, and the teacher has to be the ignorant schoolmaster, meaning that the teacher, rather than being that being part of that hierarchy, you know, teacher teaching the students, and as someone who has like more knowledge, the teacher also has to be willing to let go of all the preconceived ideas and knowledge. And that's why it's called the ignorant schoolmaster. And I talk about how my drawing companionship with children was also similar to that learning experience, both for me and the children, just like the ignorant schoolmaster and the students of that ignorant schoolmaster. So yeah, it started off by drawing like Star Wars characters and, you know, other popular culture figures. I didn't know what Paw Patrol was. I'm not a parent, so I don't know like what contemporary, you know, children's popular culture even looks like. So like Paw Patrol, Vampirina, all these things that I've definitely needed help in order for me to draw. And
capital in that classroom.
I know. So yeah, it was really interesting. And that was a great experience for me.
As you're talking about being the ignorant schoolmaster, it feels almost radical to take that stance given contemporary and really historical images of the teacher, with all of these expectations as a professional and as an adult who they have this knowledge that they are supposed to artfully transmit to children, and they're certainly supposed to maintain control. And so I wonder if you can speak to the ways that that interaction and trying on that interested adult role was challenging for you, and in what ways it felt successful.
Yeah. So you mean like my role as trying to be ignorant, and what parts was that challenging, and like how, and what aspects was that successful?
Yeah, I wonder both what the challenges were, maybe as you interacted with the children, but did you face any challenges with others about what your expectations were in the room, or expectations that maybe weren't explicit, but that are in the discourse of what a teacher is? How did you balance those things?
I would say, just like in general, that expectation of being like an adult who would still, like, although I'm not the teacher in that classroom, but who is still expected to perform ethically and socially just like standards, was in a general sense still a challenge for me. I know it sounds like interesting, but like I would give an example. So in one day, I think it was a girl who always had wanted to, you know, draw princesses. And that day she wanted me to draw Mulan for her. And I gave her my just like iPhone and let like her use my Google app to search images. I guess I would have, you know, typed in Mulan for her. But like as she was scrolling, she found an image under the Mulan image that wasn't Mulan at all, but like this, to me, an image that seemed kitsch and also a little bit sexually suggestive. And because it was in like a, you know, because like, aesthetically it was kitsch, and it also was a female figure with like exaggerated body portion, like proportions, and you know, like heavy makeup on. It was still an illustration, it was still a drawing, but to me it was really odd. It had like, you know, all these like components that you would identify as not so like child friendly image,
Like
but
character of Mulan or something.
yeah, so that's my initial like instinct to control that like moment, and be like, I had like all these thoughts going in my mind thinking, okay, so should I let, you know, her draw this? Should I draw this for her? Because again, I'm imposing my own adult assumptions that, you know, this is sexually suggestive. It has those kind of connotations. But also I do want to let go of my like my urge to control. So like I had to make a split second decision in that moment, but you know, I just carried on, and I drew that image for her. um, and then I later asked, like, why did you like that, you know, image? And then she said, you know, simply, because it's easy to fill in. Like, that was her response. So she wasn't necessarily looking into all those, like, you know, connotations. She was looking at the spatial affordances. And that was when I realized, even if like I think it's a challenge, even if I identify those moments as tricky, because I do also want to be someone who's like socially just, you know, and someone who is, you know, performing all these, you know, ethical, I guess, like standards. As an adult being in that classroom, I do need to intervene at certain points. But my challenge was, when is that moment to intervene, or when like is a you know, a moment to completely let go and see what happens and make everything emergent. So I would say those ethical decision makings is like a definitely big challenge for me to be there as an adult. But again, it's, I guess it's more successful if, you know, you learn from all those like moments, because I think having that um, you know, ethical decision making and those challenges is better than going about your normal like day by day routine without thinking. You know what I mean? Like those habitual thinking and doing with children, I think is more dangerous than having to, you know, challenge your like biases and having to like be in that like struggle, you know? So I think if you constantly make those like decision makings, I'm repeating this I guess, but like if you are willing to be surprised, to be curious, to let go of your biases, I think that itself is a great learning experience, both as a student teacher or a teacher or artist, researcher, anybody in that space being with children.
I think what was really powerful, you demonstrated in that example, this shift from, you know, the feeling that came up for you and the anxiety,
Yeah,
the concerns,
the moral panic.
yeah, this really panic,
Yeah.
to recognizing that in order to understand the situation, you saw that
Mm-hmm.
there was someone else involved in the situation who
Right.
inherently had a different perspective on what might have happened there. And I can only speculate what might have happened had you approached the child with the intent to intervene and stop rather than to
Mm-hmm.
understand. But if a child is coming to you and quite excited, draw this for me, and you say no,
I know.
what might that have done to this relationship that it sounds like in that chapter that was hard work to facilitate and maintain and keep going?
Yeah, because our saying no is coming from all these ideas that we think is morally good and ethically, good. And the child, she wouldn't have known why we were saying no, like why these decisions are being made with just a simple drawing request. Like it's simple but also very complicated to think about when we engage with children, that we are constantly making those like ethical decisions.
I think it sounds like the overall shift when you're deciding how you're going to approach children is this ethical decision, and go in, you're having those moment to moment conversations. So thank you for sharing that example. I think it was really helpful to think about alongside the philosophy that you described.
Yeah, sure.
So thank you so much for your time today, Hayan. I look forward to speaking to you more about this in the future. I'm so excited to actually learn more about sketchbooks in particular.
Thank you for having me, Alex. It was great.